So if we can manage the frequency and duration of variant conditions in our controls, then we're going to be a lot farther along and much more capable of managing and winning in this problem space than we are today.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Jack Jones, Chairman at the FAIR Institute.
I was a systems administrator back in the late 80s when viruses first raised their ugly little heads. And I was in a staff meeting and someone brought up this thing called a computer virus, and they wanted someone to volunteer to be responsible for helping the bank deal with it. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty interesting to me. I'd had a medical background, and so, in my mind, the word virus sort of triggered something. And so I volunteered to be responsible for managing antivirus at this bank. And very quickly, I realized that I'd sort of found my home, as it were, from a work perspective. I was just fascinated by just about any aspect of it, the complexity of it, the sort of protective, it appealed to my protective nature as a human. And it also took advantage of what I felt were some of my strengths in terms of creative problem solving and communication and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and it's clear that you've spent a lot of time looking at risk with the FAIR Institute. And you wrote a great piece for the CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers. And you're clearly a pioneer in this space. And I know that you wrote this book, great book, Measuring and Managing Information Security Risk, based on this FAIR methodology. And you talk in your piece about how to prioritize risk effectively and to come up with some cost-effective risk management solutions. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, organizations always have limited resources, and the cybersecurity space seems almost unlimited in the challenges we face, which means that we have to prioritize. We have to be good at prioritizing. Otherwise, we can actually put our organizations at more risk if we're making poor choices in terms of what we're focusing on and the solutions we choose and that sort of thing. And because at the end of the day, our jobs are to help our organizations experience a frequency and magnitude of loss that is acceptable to them. And in my mind, that provides essentially the primary metric for how we prioritize. What are the loss event scenarios that stand to be most painful to the organization, and can we analyze our controls and the different dimensions of our risk landscape in a way that allows us to identify where we can affect the frequency and magnitude of loss most cost effectively. And I mean, right away that calls into question some of the prevailing practices in the profession, such as And not to say that those prevailing practices don't have value, they do, but they aren't necessarily all that helpful with this problem. And that is maturity models. They can tell us, hypothetically, relatively speaking, where our organization is from a maturity perspective, but they can't tell us which control is most valuable, which part of our program is reducing the most risk. You have to do risk analysis to do that, and you have to do risk analysis quantitatively. You can't do that there are some technologies out there that provide sort of credit scores, if you will, cybersecurity credit-like scores for organizations. And those can be very useful data points. But again, they don't help us know which part of our program is providing the most value and which part is providing the least value, and therefore where we should be focusing and that sort of thing. So, this ability to measure risk quantitatively in dollars and cents is where we can do return on investment sorts of analyses to focus and prioritize and choose solutions that are more cost effective for our organizations.
So that's a very good point about looking at the maturity models and being able to assess that risk, and that we don't get down to that control level. How do you determine what controls are contributing to that maturity and which ones we should focus on the most?
So in order to do that, an organization first has to understand very clearly what are the loss event scenarios that are most relevant to them, that they most want to manage against and avoid. And once you identify those loss event scenarios, then you can identify the controls that are most relevant to those scenarios. So for scenarios related to web application compromises or something like that, you're going to have certain controls in your portfolio that are more relevant to those scenarios. For scenarios relevant to, or scenarios such as, outages due to, weather events or ransomware or whatever, again, you're going to have certain controls in your portfolio that are more or less relevant to those scenarios. So you start by knowing what those scenarios are that are most relevant to you. Then you can begin to look at your controls portfolio and say, okay, this control is relevant to these 3 events or scenarios, but not relevant to these 2. And that gives you a starting point. And then you can begin to get into the actual risk analysis of looking at frequencies of attack and control efficacy and the impact sort of metrics too for if the event materializes.
So once you develop those scenarios, how do you translate that into what the risk appetite for the organization should be?
Great question. So I did a presentation at RSA a year and a half ago on risk appetite that I thought was one of my better presentations, and it's gotten very good feedback. But the bottom line is, or one of the takeaways, let me put it that way, from this was that organizations don't have, at least if you approach risk appetite the way I do, organizations don't have a risk appetite. They will have multiple risk appetites. They'll have a risk appetite for outage types of events, which will be different from an appetite for a data breach or a fraud event or these sorts of things. So again, if you understand the loss event scenarios you're subject to, now you can begin to say, okay, for this event, let's say it's an operational outage of a key business process, you can say, all right, we can withstand the business, and these will be executives answering the questions, not you or me or the cybersecurity wonk in the organization. They'll say, all right, we want to go to great lengths to avoid an outage of more than 48 hours, just to pick a number right now. Mm-hmm. Then you can say, all right, that's the event size that we're trying to avoid. So that's one dimension of our risk appetite for that scenario. Then you can say, all right, what is the probability we're willing to live with of that event happening in the next 12 months? Is it 10%? Is it 5%? Is it 2%? But there's some probability statement that goes with, that size impact that you're trying to manage against. And once you've chosen that second dimension, that probability dimension, then you have your risk appetite. We have, let's say, a 5%, we have appetite for 5% probability of 48-hour outage or longer. And now, again, you can begin to look at your controls and you can say, all right, given the controls that we have in place, do we have greater than, and the threat landscape we face, do we have greater than or less than a 5% chance of having that kind of event? And so, the great thing I believe, with this approach to risk appetite, it is incredibly actionable. It's easy to understand, first of all, and it's incredibly actionable. You can actually take explicit measures to, drive down the probability or drive down the duration, of events and that sort of thing. So, it's, again, I do a more complete job of describing it in that presentation, which is a video on the internet if anyone's interested. But that's how I approach risk appetite and define it.
And how do you decide what those controls are and how much they're going to reduce that risk?
Well, historically, what we've relied on is sort of the experience of the practitioner and the analyst to say, okay, well, we've got, this kind of patch routine and these kinds of recovery capabilities, and we think that, it's going to affect the frequency or magnitude of loss by this, that, or the other. And that can work, but it is less reliable because it's sort of dependent on the mental model of the analyst. Now, in just the last couple of weeks, I published a new piece of work that I've spent the last several years creating called the FAIR Controls Analytics Model. And it provides what I refer to as controls physiology. So here's the analogy. If you're thinking about the human body, and if you ask the question, what's more important in the practice of medicine, anatomy or physiology? Well, the answer you should get is neither. You need both if you're going to practice, decent medicine. You need to know the parts of the body, that's the anatomy, and you need to know how they function both individually and as a system. That's the physiology. Well, in cybersecurity to date, we've operated with almost a sole focused on anatomy. Our control frameworks, ISO and NIST and whatnot, these are controls anatomy, almost pure and simple, and have left the physiology, how these things affect risk and how they affect one another in affecting risk, has been left to the mental model of the individual. So what I've published is this FAIR Controls Analytics Model, or FAIR-CAM, that defines controls physiology. It defines the functions, the different ways in which controls affect risk, both directly or indirectly, as well as how they affect one another. And so by combining that with the control frameworks that we already know and love, the controls anatomy, so to speak, now we're in a position to much more reliably measure the value, the efficacy and value of controls.
I think that's very interesting because it is the interaction of those controls that helps reduce our risk. What are some of those controls that you've found in doing all these risk assessments that seem to bubble to the top that, should be table stakes within our organizations?
For me, a lot of the most significant controls are what I refer to and what are referred to in my controls analytics model as variance management controls, essentially managing the frequency and duration of deficiencies in other controls. Because when breaches occur, at least in my experience, now this may not have been everybody's experience, but every breach I've ever been witness to or victim of, one or more controls was not working as intended. It was not implemented or hadn't been maintained or whatever the case might be. But it was what I refer to as being in a variant state, not operating as intended. And so if we can manage the frequency and duration of variant conditions in our controls, then we're going to be a lot farther along and much more capable of managing and winning in this problem space than we are today. Now, it's, that to say managing the frequency and duration of control variance, that's a simple concept. It's not rocket science. It gets more complicated when you're talking about populations of controls that have relatively complicated interactions and dependencies. But the fundamental truth is there that we need to manage the variance of controls. And so that's sort of the high level answer, if you will, to that question.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers. So what you're saying is that maybe we think that we're better off than we are in a lot of our organizations?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially if we're over-reliant on sort of the compliance mindset or the control frameworks and maturity models. Because none of the frameworks that exist today or the maturity models take into account the dependencies between controls and the effect. They don't differentiate, for instance, those controls that are variance management controls that affect the frequency or duration of deficiencies in controls. They don't differentiate that from controls that directly affect frequency or magnitude of loss, right? So take access privileges, for example. Access privileges or access restrictions or loss event control. They directly affect the ability of some bad actor to do some nefarious deed, let's say. But if they're in a variant state, if those access controls aren't in the condition they're supposed to be in, those restrictions aren't there, then of course the bad actor can do whatever they want. But the question is, how did they get to be in a variant state? What variance prevention control failed? And how long did it take us to discover that they were variant, and how long did it take us to correct them, right? So these dependencies, we can check a box in a maturity model or in a control framework assessment to say, yeah, we have access privileges, least privilege. Absolutely. Yeah, we do that. But I bet you don't do it perfectly. There's some frequency and duration of varying conditions in your access privilege portfolio. And if the controls that manage that are not strong, then the fact that you've said, yeah, we have least privilege, that's inaccurate in terms of it misrepresents your actual control state and the level of risk your organization has. And these relationships and dependencies are riddled throughout our controls portfolios. But again, none of the frameworks out there today, none of the maturity models, none of the control frameworks account for these relationships and dependencies. We just go through the checklist and say we have it or we don't have it, or we assign some ordinal label to it, a color or a number or something like that. And then we average a bunch of things. And we think that accurately represents the maturity of our organization or the efficacy of our program. And we couldn't be more wrong.
And you gave a great example in the CISO Compass book about when you were faced with a PCI application and looking at encrypting the databases. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah, that was when PCI requirements first came out, and I worked for a company that had ungodly amounts of credit card information, and I thought, oh boy, well, I better look into this encryption thing. And I went to the encryption vendors and said, can you encrypt this much data with these kinds of throughput requirements? And they all said, well, we haven't done anything that big or with those throughput requirements before, but we'd be happy to try. When do we start? Oh, and by the way, it's going to cost millions of dollars. And it's going to mean you're going to probably have to rewrite some of your applications and have, those sorts of disruptions. And I said, okay, well, just hang on for a second. Let me go back to the drawing board for a minute. So I went back and I identified the loss event scenarios where encryption is relevant as a control. Encryption of data at rest is a relevant control. And I evaluated the different controls that we had in place and in the threat landscape we faced. And I did a fair analysis that said, all right, here's how much loss exposure we have without encryption today. I said, now let's factor in encryption. How much less risk will we have? Factored that in, got it, a new number with less, representing less risk. And then I asked the question, are there other controls I can apply that are also relevant to those scenarios that can lower the frequency or magnitude of loss? And of course there were. So I evaluated those and I came up with a set of alternative controls, alternative to encryption of data at rest, that I could apply. And I did the analysis factoring in those controls and determined that I could actually reduce risk more using these alternative controls at a fraction of the cost of encryption of data at rest. The question, of course, was, would the QSA sign off on it? And so I had them come in and I showed them my homework, the analysis I did, the rationale and the numbers. And they said, can't argue with any of that. They signed and off we went. And what I was able to do through that exercise, and, that probably took me a week's worth of work to maybe not full time, but, I probably spent a week working on that part of every day. But at the end of that exercise, I was able to satisfy, this PCI requirement and save my organization a lot of money, well over $1 million. And also we were able to avoid all the disruption of rewriting applications and all the other things that were going to have to be done to enable encryption of data at rest. So, the notion or the question that often gets asked of quantitative risk analysis and FAIR is, is it really worth it? Well, certainly in that case it was, and in many cases it is, but yeah, that was the example in the book.
Yeah, and I can see where you save the money. And do you think today you would be making a different decision with where technology has moved to? And is that something that you would review on an annual basis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the encryption technologies have come a long way since then. And so the cost has come down and sort of the difficulty of implementing it has been reduced. So, the result an analysis today of that same situation might have different results. And that's the thing about our problem space is it's really dynamic, which means we have to pay attention to the changes that occur, both the good ones and the bad ones. And if we've done our homework, in the analysis we've done in the past and can refer to that, right? So let's say I'd done that analysis, and then let's say 5 years later, if I was still working in the same place, the encryption technology had come a long ways. I could analyze it and see if it made sense to switch to encryption of data at rest. But if I hadn't done my homework in the first case, if it was just me waving a wet finger in the air back in the day, and then somehow convincing the QSA that they should sign off on, my silly idea not to employ encryption of data at rest, then I would have had to make the same subjective, unsupported arguments to the QSA, 5 years later. But of course, if I was proposing to actually implement encryption, they'd probably go, yay. But regardless, having the homework documented, the analysis and rationale and whatnot documented, gives you an opportunity to evaluate against specific data points and assumptions that you don't have if you're just going, yeah, that feels medium to me. And then a couple of years later, you feel like it's high. Well, there's nothing to support that, nothing at least formal or rigorous.
Before we close, and this is great information, what are your views around qualitative versus quantitative risk assessment? So
there's nothing inherently wrong with qualitative measurement. I mean, it has limitations, but I still do qualitative measurements. But here's the difference, and this is what it seems like nobody pays any attention to, is if regardless of how you're measuring, whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative, three things are true in every case. You have a scope, the thing you're measuring, you're measuring something, right? Qualitatively or quantitatively. So there's that. You have a model. Now, it could be a formal model like FAIR, or it could be someone's mental model, right? But a model is involved. So you have scope and a model. And then the last thing is data. There's always data. And you commonly hear the question, well, I don't know if I have enough data to do quantitative. Well, do you have enough? How much data do you need to do qualitative? I mean, your qualitative rating is based on some form of data. It has to be. Otherwise, you're just making up something, right? You might just well be choosing your colors at random. So those three things, scope, model, and data, are true. Now, if I'm going to do a qualitative analysis and I want it to make sense and stand up and be defensible, I'm going to have a clearly defined scope. What exactly am I measuring? What is the loss event scenario and the sort of the specifics of what I'm measuring? If you don't have that, it doesn't matter what your model is or what your data are, you're going to have a crap output, right? But let's say we've done a decent scope, and then it comes down to the model. Is it a clearly defined model like FAIR, or is it someone's mental model where you don't know what the assumptions are and what their internal calculus is for crunching whatever data they're going to apply? The problem with mental models is all that's undefined. And then data, well, you have the data you have. Qualitative or quantitative, you have the data you have. You can make good use of it or poor use of it. But here's my point. The vast majority of qualitative analysis, and I mean like 99+%, have no clear scope, are operating purely from someone's undefined mental model, and they couldn't even tell you what data they're applying to their undefined scope and their undefined mental model. Right? That is the purest recipe for unreliability I can imagine. Right? So if I'm going to do qualitative, I'm going to scope clearly. I'm going to use FAIR because it's a good, clear, well-proven model. And I'm going to be clear about what rationale and data I'm applying to this. And that'll stand up fine. It'll have all the limitations of qualitative that are inherent in qualitative. You can't do cost-benefit. You're very limited in terms of the granularity of prioritization and that sort of thing. But you can still make better informed decisions by it. So qualitative is fine, given you have clear scope, clear model, and know what data you're applying. But
go ahead.
I was just going to say, but here's the thing. If you're going to take the time to scope and you're going to take the time to apply a model, and you recognize that you have the data you have virtually the difference in level of effort from qualitative to quantitative is marginal. So, there's just a ton of misperception around qualitative versus quantitative. And that sort of sums up my take on it.
I think that's a great distinction, and I've never really heard it put quite that way. I think you define that really, really well. So is there one piece of last advice that you'd like to leave with CISOs as they go down this journey?
I guess the last piece of advice is don't be a lemming. When it's as busy as we are, it's easy to just say, well, the herd is heading this way. I'm going to head that way too. Safety in numbers and all that. But the simple fact is that we have to, maybe not in every case, but we have to have questioning minds. We have to apply critical thinking. And when we just accept quote unquote best practice or sort of the norm, I believe we disregard an obligation on our part to help our profession grow and evolve. And we also miss an opportunity to help our organizations be more successful as businesses or as organizations. So back to that example about the encryption of data at rest, I could have followed the herd. I could have spent millions of dollars and had 18 months of painful impact on the organization. My life would have been easy. Not easy, but the decision, I could have done that, but there absolutely would not have been the right thing to do. And when we just sort of go along with the herd, as I feel like we often do, then we're abdicating, I think, a huge responsibility as a professional.
Well, and thanks, Jack, for not being a lemming, because we wouldn't have the fair approach today if you would have been a lemming yourself. So thank you for that. And thanks for your contribution to the CISO Compass book and all that you've done for the industry. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cybereason is the champion for today's defenders, providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cybereason.com/CISO stories.